So I'll make it full screen now. Yeah, you're seeing it now? Right. Okay, so friends, we are here to discuss some of the challenges in post-COVID-19 infections. And what we really mean is post-COVID infection, because there is something called as a viral sepsis, which occurs with severe COVID. So we are not really talking of that type of sepsis. We are talking about what happens after the SARS-CoV-2 virus has had a rampage in our human body, and then sepsis occurs. And now, what are the reasons why this sepsis occurs? That is primarily because of immune dysregulation, because of the virus itself. Then, obviously, the patient requires steroids or other immunosuppressants. And this virus also, let me tell you, itself damages the beta cells of the pancreas. And therefore, hyperglycemia as a result of SARS-CoV-2 also occurs. So really speaking, these are the factors which places the patient at risk of getting infections. Now, additionally, there are going to be exposures in the hospital. Now, often the patient gets admitted as an emergency, and then emergency procedures are required. And we know that when procedures are done on an emergency basis, there is a difficult asepsis there. So then there is a prolonged ICU stay, and therefore these patients now are at risk of getting either bacteremia, fungemia, or both. And sometimes all this leads to metastatic infections because of resistant flora, because of use of antibiotics. There can also be selection of resistant endogenous colonizing flora. Okay, so all of us, are colonized by so many organisms on our skin, on the GI tract, in the respiratory tract, and so on. So once procedures are done, as well as antibiotics are given, the susceptible organisms are wiped out, and what we are left with are only the resistant endogenous flora. Additionally, there can be exposures. So even after the patient has been discharged, the patient is still immunocompromised. Remember, the effects of steroids, the effect of the virus still makes him immunocompromised. And there might be exposures in the community, including whatever water. Sometimes I recently saw a case of typhoid which developed soon after COVID because of the exposures, because of unclean water and food. But mainly we are talking of spores of fungi, mainly mucormycosis as well as aspergillosis. And we know that in our country there are lots of these spores in the community. And finally, we can even have activation of latent infections. So latent infections include most importantly TB, but it can also include HSV, VZV, CMV, and so many others. All of us are infected in a latent way by some of these infections, and those will now flare up because of the immunocompromise. Now let's take this first case. This is a 73-year-old male patient. He has hypertension and coronary artery disease. He has fairly severe left ventricular dysfunction. He has stable CKD creatinine roughly around 2 or around 3 or so, but he is not on hemodialysis. Now in February 2021, he had mild COVID-19, but despite that was actually given steroids. Now this is something which we at least should not do in the third wave, that patients who do not require oxygen and are having really mild COVID-19 should not be given steroids. Now by April 21st, that means 2 months later, he developed slowly progressive headache as well as neck pain, and that kept worsening over the next 1 month. So then he presented to our hospital Jupiter to a neurosurgeon, and what was found here was there was sphenoid sinusitis. So here is the sphenoid, and you see it's all thickened over there. So mucosa is grossly thickened in the sphenoid sinus, as well as there is skull base osteomyelitis. So what you are actually seeing is destruction of the clivus of the skull. So if you see this bone over here, it is destroyed. It should be neat and clean like this, and it should be in its entirety. Whereas here you can see a piece of clivus is literally seen floating there. And you can see the same thing here on the lateral view. So this is destruction of the clivus, and it is in relation to this sphenoid sinus, which is also showing sphenoid sinusitis. So this was seen by the neurosurgeon, and he made an ID reference for starting something. Now here is one important step, that as an ID physician, we must say that empiric therapy is not possible. Okay, so just because you see something like a sphenoid sinusitis, you see osteomyelitis, which is involving the skull base, the reflex action is to start antibiotics. But that is not the correct thing. It's nothing wrong if we say that we cannot guess what is this organism, and therefore empiric therapy is just going to make matters worse. So we should not say that we can start any empiric therapy. So the neurosurgeon obliged by doing a neuronavigation assisted procedure. And as you can see, he went down there and exactly went to this same area where the clivus was involved. And when he punctured that area, he found that a pus came out. So the pus was drained and the clivus sequestrectomy, that means the dead part of the clivus bone, he was able to remove that. Now, when this pus was examined, what was seen was this. So this is called as a calcofluor stain. And what you are seeing is this narrow acute angle branching hyphae. And you can see on close examination some septae there. So these imaging features, morphological features, indicate that this is aspergillosis. Okay, so this was seen in the pus. But what can the clinician do? However, here we must remember that in post-COVID-19, it appears to me at least that invasive mucormycosis is more common than invasive aspergillosis. Then about 10 to 15% of the patients do have a mixed infection. So they have both aspergillosis as well as mucormycosis. And here if we start voriconazole for this patient, because that is supposed to be the drug of choice for aspergillosis, we must remember here that voriconazole actually increases the virulence if there is mucorales. Okay, figuratively it is said that it gives new life to mucorales. For this reason, it was not very safe or a good idea to start with voriconazole, but start with some other drug which works both for aspergillosis as well as for mucormycosis. So what happened later, and for this reason we preferred isavuconazole. So now the diligent search of the dissolved sequestrum tissue. Remember that the bone will require some time for it to get dissolved, and after that only the pathologist can examine that. So when that was examined, here now you see wide aseptate and right angle branching fungi. So these are much thicker than the aspergillus. So this is definitely suggestive of mucorales, and it is actually confirmed by histopathology. So this is histopathology of that dead sequestrum, which shows some bone but more of dead tissue. And if you see again here, this is this fungus which is broad aseptate. Okay, so this patient definitely had both aspergillosis as well as mucormycosis. So now let's see what treatment we can give for this patient and what is the clinical problem with this patient. So we know that he has aspergillosis, we know that he has mucorales infection, we know that this is rhino-orbital and to some extent not really cerebral but rhino-orbital and involving the skull base. So the bone is also involved here. Also we must remember here that the patient has CKD, chronic kidney disease, but he is not on hemodialysis and he has fairly severe left ventricular dysfunction. So if we look at all these four factors and we have 4 drugs to choose from, so let's see how would we choose these drugs. Okay, so we know that one of the important drugs in invasive fungal infections, invasive mold infections is liposomal amphotericin B. But we know that it is not the drug of choice for aspergillus based on one trial called as the Herbeck trial. So in that they found that amphotericin B showed 15% less survival as compared to voriconazole. Although this was amphotericin B deoxycholate. So currently we tend to use less of this deoxycholate. However, in this second wave we had to use because liposomal amphotericin B was in really short supply, and we will probably discuss these points later on. Also, if there are some aspergilli such as Aspergillus flavus which has intrinsic resistance to amphotericin B. Okay, so that's why this can be a problem. What about, will it work for mucorales? Yes, it is the preferred drug for mucorales. What about rhino-orbital and bone? Yes, it penetrates the bone, but we really need higher doses if we want good bone penetration. And can we really give this patient higher doses? Higher than means like more than 3 milligram per kilogram, something like 5 milligram per kilogram or even greater, it will be such a big problem. Why? Because he already has chronic kidney disease. If we tilt the balance, he will go on hemodialysis, and he also has LV dysfunction. So to give a large amount of fluid as well as saline loading, which we require to give to protect from nephrotoxicity of amphotericin B, it will be a problem. So for this reason, I have put a cross mark over here. Let's look at voriconazole. As it has a labeled indication, it will suit the aspects that it of mucormycosis, so we don't really want that to happen. What about its penetration into the brain bone? It penetrates very well into CSF as well as the bone, as well as the brain. About bone, we are not very certain whether it penetrates very well. If we have to give an intravenous preparation with voriconazole, then that does contain this beta-cyclodextrin, which will again be a problem in a patient who has CKD and who is not on hemodialysis. Let's consider posaconazole. Now, posaconazole was found to be non-inferior to voriconazole as regards aspergillus in a recent study. So, okay, this seems to be okay for aspergillus. Certainly, it is one of the drugs which can be used for mucorales. Although currently the main indications for posaconazole have been prophylaxis, and posaconazole has been greatly studied in hematologic malignancy population for prophylaxis and to some extent less as treatment. However, it can be used in renal failure if the patient is not going to tolerate liposomal amphotericin B, as well as for salvage. Salvage means those patients who are failing on treatment with amphotericin B, yes, we can definitely use this. The brain and serum concentrations are more or less the same, and the penetration into the bone is again unknown. We have absolutely no data on whether it penetrates bone very well. Now, again, this contains beta-cyclodextrin, and therefore, if we have to give it in CKD, there is going to be a problem. Now, what about the new one, the isavuconazole? Now, this has a labeled indication for aspergillus. It also has a labeled indication for, this is a study called as a SECURE study, and this is called as a VITAL study. So this has a labeled indication for mucorales as well. It penetrates the brain very well, and there is some degree of bone penetration, although again, little is known about that. And it can also be used in CKD, even the intravenous preparation, but because this is a water-soluble drug and this does not contain, the IV preparation also does not contain cyclodextrin. Now, what about combination? Often we talk about this combination. People, patients ask us, colleagues ask us. So we really have great uncertainty about the efficacy of combination, whether there is additional efficacy of giving two drugs such as an azole along with amphotericin B. There is no plausible reason for synergy. That means amphotericin B acts at the synthesis, or it actually acts at ergosterol level. Ergosterol is the sterol which is present in the fungal cell membrane. And azoles work against an enzyme called as 14-alpha demethylase. So this is an enzyme which synthesizes this ergosterol. So if you block that synthesis, then how can amphotericin B work very well? Because the target is already depleted. However, pathogen coverage could be widened. I showed you that there are some such as aspergillus flavus, which may not be susceptible to amphotericin B. In this situation, perhaps if we give an azole along with amphotericin B, it might work better. However, no trial has shown superiority, which actually needs large numbers. See, the simple argument is like this, that if you say that a combination is to be used, then the combination should show superiority. You cannot say that the combination is equivalent to a single drug. Okay, so then why give the combination? Okay, so this is just common sense, but sometimes we need to talk about it. So in order to show superiority, you need really very large numbers. At the same time, no such study has been done, but the absence of evidence of benefit is not actually evidence of absence. Okay, so that leaves a nagging doubt in our mind whether the combination may have some benefit. Now, if at all there is some benefit of this combination, who do you think would be the best patient for receiving the combination? Obviously, those patients who are at the highest risk of poor outcome. And actually, there was an opportunity to study this combination during the second wave epidemic when we had such a huge number of Mucor as well as Aspergillus. It's not so easy to make a comment whether the drug has worked or the combination has worked or what has worked, because this outcome is determined by many other factors, including the completeness of surgery, the control of diabetes, control of the underlying and reversal of the underlying risk factors. So all these also play an extremely important part in determining what is going to be the final outcome. And therefore, it is not very easy to say whether this combination or this drug worked and the other drug did not work, and so on. Also, due to some treatment interruptions with amphotericin B, lack of availability or toxicity can create a problem. And in that sense, the role of the second drug is sometimes viewed as that of a supporting drug. So what messages come from this case? That empiric treatment should be avoided. Okay, so that is the most important message for us physicians, that when we see this kind of a problem and the people, others, our colleagues ask us to start something, we should say that no, this is not possible. We should get a tissue diagnosis. We should get a microbiological diagnosis. So this kind of a pursuit of the diagnosis, if necessary by invasive methods, is very, very important. Multidisciplinary approach pays rewards, like all this neuronavigation, biopsy, histopathology, microbiology, all this came to us in order to solve the problem of this patient. Also, as a physician, we need to consider what is the current epidemiology of invasive mold infections. Like I said, that to my mind, invasive aspergillosis is slightly less common as compared to invasive mucormycosis in the last few months. Okay, so this local epidemiology and the timing of it is very, very important. Secondly, the first organism which was found was Aspergillus. But our search should not stop short even when one pathogen is found, because, as I said, mixed infections can occur. And actually, treatment for one, such as voriconazole for aspergillosis, may actually favor worse outcome with mucormycosis. So the choice of drugs depends on the nature of the infection, the organism or multiple organisms which are there, the penetration to the site of infection, the adverse effects which are potential or actual, the patient profile, and at times by patient preference. Now let me remind you that not everything post-COVID-19 is mucormycosis. Okay, so now here you have this patient who's got bleeding in the mouth. There are lots of blood clots here. You can also see something here. There is some big blood clot here, but there is also an ulceration on the bridge of the nose. Okay, so what is this? This patient is also a patient of COVID-19, has received lots of steroids, but this is herpes simplex infection. Okay, so this is all bleeding from ulcers in the mouth as well as ulcers here and here. This is not mucormycosis. Now, look at this patient. This patient also had a problem, and the patient complained of headache and swelling in the eye. So now everyone is so charged with this diagnosis that the ENT surgeon went on and did a sinuscopy and actually did a debridement of sinus mucosa. But afterwards they found that there was nothing. So when the ID reference was done, we actually see here that there is redness as well as this faint. You can see these blisters there. So actually this is ophthalmic varicella zoster. Okay, so naturally the patient will complain of pain in the eye, some swelling of the eye, as well as headache, which is unilateral, and therefore it may be, thought that this could be mucormycosis, but one can get tricked into this. Now, this is another patient who had severe throat pain, severe weight loss, fever was there, low WBC count, low, everything was low, pancytopenia was there. And actually there are these ulcers, but these are not ulcers on the hard palate. These are ulcers on the soft palate. Okay, and this turned out to be actually histoplasmosis. So this was also something which might tend to resemble mucorales, because it's involving the mouth, nose, and so on, and eyes. Now look at this patient. This patient actually has sinus thickening, as you can see here very well, and there are some 2-3 necrotic spots on the turbinates of the nose, and examination of that did show mucor. So now you're familiar with this, that this is a calcofluor stain which shows aseptate, wide and right angle branching mold. But this patient also had a headache, and if you notice, there are two lesions here. As you can see here and here, which are not actually adjacent to the sinus and orbit at all. Okay, so they are non-contiguous, and actually these are tuberculomas which the patient had. Okay, so mucor was there, and this is additional tuberculoma, because TB also will reactivate when the patient has hyperglycemia, has received steroids, and so on. Okay, so one diagnosis is sometimes not enough. The patient has multiple diagnoses. So unless one carefully sees the imaging features, does maybe a MR spectroscopy and so on, then only you will know that this is not mucor. Otherwise, you will be happy only to continue the treatment for mucor. This patient actually needed treatment for TB also. And when you give the treatment for TB, remember that there is rifampicin. So rifampicin will lower the levels of all the azoles very much. So you actually cannot use rifampicin for treating this TB, because the patient also requires either posaconazole or isavuconazole or something like that for this mucormycosis. So you have to bear in mind the interactions also. Now let's take this next patient. So this patient was who had a PTCA 2 years ago, and in May he had mild COVID-19. He was admitted elsewhere. Now records of that discharge from that hospital actually do not show whether any hypoxia was present. But despite that, the discharge summary says that the patient received steroids, ivermectin, doxycycline, azithromycin, vitamins, other antibiotics, and was discharged after 15 days. Now, after his discharge, 5 days later, he developed abdominal pain, which became very severe, increased progressively. So he was admitted to the same previous hospital. Even more antibiotics were given for a day or two. And the investigations done over there, we showed that there is this large colonic shadow there. So there seems to be an abscess and a perforation of the colon. So pericolonic abscess is seen, as well as you can see 2-3 very large abscesses in the liver. With this, he was transferred to Jupiter. And what was found is he had anemia, he had extremely high WBC count, so 73,000, as well as altered LFTs. And as I said, the same sealed colonic perforation, large liver abscesses. So probably this was likely due to portal pyemia. He still has some residual lung shadows, as you can see, which are consistent with recent COVID-19. And again, these very large liver abscesses were seen. So what was done? Meropenem, teicoplanin, and metronidazole were given by the surgical team. They did a right hemicolectomy, as well as drainage of the liver abscesses and iliotransverse anastomosis. And with that, the patient was referred for an ID opinion for antimicrobial advice. So, we really went into the depths of what was given to this patient earlier, because that will really help us to fashion what treatment should be given to this patient. Remember, the surgical team had started meropenem, teicoplanin, and metronidazole. So when we examined his old papers, we found that this patient, when he was admitted in the first admission, not the second, but the first admission, so there meropenem was given, as well as a small dose of linezolid was given. Okay, so if you see this, this is what the patient has recently received, then there may be a problem in again continuing the same drug like meropenem. So if you analyze this case, what do we need to cover? We need the gram-negative bacilli from the gut, because obviously this is a pericolic abscess, portal pyemia, which has produced large abscesses in the liver. So we need to keep in mind Klebsiella, E. coli, and Enterobacter. And also remember that these organisms or the resistant strains of these organisms could have been selected by prior carbapenem use. The next one is another organism which comes from the gut, and that is Enterococci. So obviously we are not going to think of Staphylococcus or something like that in this patient. We are going to think of bowel-derived organisms. So Enterococci may be derived from the gut. And again, the problem is this patient was exposed to some amount of linezolid. So we don't know whether it will be, what will work against this. Anaerobes are also expected. Large abscesses are there. So definitely anaerobes are expected. And this is something like a delayed perforation. So remember that Candida is also an inhabitant of our bowel. Okay, and if you have something in the abdomen which is going on for a few days, there is a perforation which is leaking. So the bowel contents are slowly entering into that abscess. then candida becomes important. If you have just a acute appendicitis, even if it is perforated, you will not really find candida coming up quickly. However, something which is a delayed perforation, or sometimes multiple surgeries have been done, in those patients candida is likely to be a true pathogen in the intra-abdominal infection. So looking at all this, what will we think of? So if this patient has already been exposed to meropenem, it is likely that he will have carbapenem resistant Enterobacteriaceae, and therefore ceftazidime avibactam plus aztreonam might be a good drug to use in this patient. Then to cover the enterococci, we might probably want to use teicoplanin, but we don't know whether it might be even teicoplanin resistant because the patient has been exposed to linezolid. Now remember here that if meropenem is being given, you don't need coverage, additional coverage of anaerobes. But if you are going to switch meropenem to ceftazidime avibactam and aztreonam, then that does not cover the anaerobes. So with this, you will need to give metronidazole. And for the candida in a patient who may be having such a severe disease, we might probably want to use an echinocandin just because the patient is in a serious condition. It may be possible that this candida, which is derived from his own bowel, is unlikely to be fluconazole resistant, and maybe even fluconazole will work. But the guideline also tells us that we may want to use echinocandin at least initially when the patient is seriously ill. So this was the treatment which was selected for empiric use. So I have explained to you what are we suspecting and therefore what drugs are we going to give. See, it is very important not just to start with antibiotics, but this kind of thinking is required. So we need to think of what is this patient's profile, what is going on with him, what is his prior exposure to antimicrobials, which are the organisms which are expected, what might be their resistance or susceptibility, and then you design a particular regimen for this patient. So now what was found on the smear was something very interesting. So this is the smear from the liver abscess, and this is what we found on culture. So here you are seeing actually a budding yeast of candida, and this is what is called as pseudohyphae of the candida. You can see this in the KOH preparation also, as well as in the stain preparation. So finding this pseudohyphae makes two organisms less likely. So these are two organisms, Candida glabrata as well as Candida auris, which actually are important because they are fairly resistant, but they do not produce pseudohyphae. So if you have found pseudohyphae, it is unlikely that that will be glabrata or auris. The culture, so a pus which was found in that syringe, which was aspirated from the liver abscess, has grown this Klebsiella pneumoniae, and as you can see, it is resistant to almost everything. Now, additionally, three organisms were seen in the liver abscess. So one was this Klebsiella, as I showed you. So if you look at it, it is resistant to everything. It is only having cholesterol MIC of less than 0.5, and that is labeled as susceptible. This is what we follow by, if you look at the UCAST guidelines. But if you look at CLSI guidelines, which is done in United States, they don't have this susceptible category at all for colistin or polymyxin B. Okay, the other organism was indeed Candida albicans. So it was not glabrata, not Klebsiella, and also not auris. It was nice and susceptible. So it was susceptible to micafungin, but it was also susceptible to even fluconazole. And look at what was the third organism. And this was also something which we expected, but didn't expect Enterococcus faecium, because the commonest is Enterococcus faecalis. But probably what must have happened is this patient, if you remember, was given linezolid for no real rhyme or reason. And now you have this Enterococcus faecium, which is actually resistant to linezolid. Look at this. So what are the messages which come from this case? So mild COVID-19 is not commonly associated with bacterial infection. I think we need to remember this lesson very, very clearly. And therefore, empiric carbapenem, linezolid, and antifungal agents should all be avoided in the interest of stewardship. Remember, this patient had just mild COVID-19, and yet he received meropenem, linezolid, and something. And of course, steroids. Now, steroids are associated with colonic perforation. Now, this is not just in COVID. We have seen this before. Patients who receive steroids for, say, nephrotic syndrome, so many other things can also have colonic perforation. And this kind of a delayed perforation that I talked about can have polymicrobial flora. So you remember his pain started, and then for over 5 days it went on increasing. Then he went to the other hospital, took some treatment, and came again after 2 days more. So it's a 7-day delayed perforation. So when you have that, you are going to see a lot of different types of organisms. So they are going to be polymicrobial flora. So what you expect here is the gram-negative bacilli such as carbapenem-resistant Enterobacterialis because of prior use, Enterococci, Candida, and anaerobes. So all these will need to be covered. The important message here is previous antibiotic use has to be reviewed and appropriate empiric choice has to be made. Okay, so no use just starting something without any relation to what was received by the patient previously. Also, we must remember that ceftazidime avibactam plus aztreonam works actually better than carbapenem, better than polymyxins for carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae. And the species and susceptibility of Candida can actually be guessed by the morphological and epidemiological clues. Okay, so morphological clue was that there was pseudohyphae there, and epidemiological clue because Candida auris actually is not bowel derived. Okay, it comes from a nosocomial source. So it was very unlikely when you found it in the colonic perforation as well as in the liver abscess that it could have come from a central venous catheter. It has to be an endogenous Candida, and therefore most likely either tropicalis or albicans. We'll move to the next case. Now this was a fairly elderly person with fever, cough, increasing dyspnea. He became seriously ill, then collapsed. He was brought to Jupiter and intubated in the emergency room. This is what I am telling you, that when the patient comes in such a serious condition, you know, everyone, there is a big code blue or something like that, and aseptic sterile precautions may not be followed very well. X-ray showed mild non-specific abnormalities. These were actually very early days of COVID. This was sometime in April or May of last year. So tracheal aspirate was positive for SARS-CoV-2 by PCR. His oxygen requirement worsened. He received dexamethasone, remdesivir, and tocilizumab, and there was a gradual improvement. But 7 days later, there was a recurrence of his fever, worsening O2 requirement. Now purulent secretions developed, and there was a rise in WBC and PCT. As you there is a blue shadow in the left lower zone, and you have worsening oxygen requirement, fever, purulent secretions. Everything is now telling that this is likely to be ventilator-associated pneumonia. So there was a strong suspicion of this VAP, and the tracheal aspirate and blood culture was sent. Along with that, we sent serum beta-glucan and galactomannan. Now remember, this patient had received 7 days ago both steroids as well as tocilizumab. So what infections can we expect after receiving this IL-6 receptor blocker? So it can be bacterial, it can be Candida, Aspergillus, PCP, Cryptococcus, TB, varicella zoster, and so on. And the immunosuppression as a result of TOSI would last for almost a month or even longer. Okay, so the patient, even after the patient has improved or has not improved, he still is at a big risk for getting this. So empiric meropenem was started for this patient, and this was found in the endotracheal secretion. So we found more than 10 raised to 5 gram-negative bacilli, and these were identified as Acinetobacter baumannii. So now the question, also always look at the smear of this particular tracheal aspirate. So you find that there are more than 25 pus cells, whereas epithelial cells are very few, and many cocobacilli are seen. So you are seeing these bacilli, and we know that Acinetobacter is a cocobacillus. Okay, so everything is matching here. Now, what treatment to give for this Acinetobacter? So that I'm again going to discuss that as empiric decision making. So how do we make this empiric choice? So it depends on the likelihood of infection. Yes, certainly this patient has a definitely infection like a VAP. Patient level factors: is an elderly person, he is seriously ill. Prior screening data, if we don't have in this patient. Local epidemiology of pathogens, and I'm going to discuss this in some detail. And sometimes rapid molecular tests may all be integrated, but many of these may not be readily available. So finally, the physician has to make a judgment on all these factors, but Prior screening data as well as rapid molecular tests may not be available in all centers. Now, when you see such a patient who is serious, what is the percentage that you want your treatment to be successful? Okay, so the patient physician accepted thresholds for being able to cover the pathogen which is actually involved in this is 80% for mild and 90% for severe. So if you see a patient with severe illness, my treatment has to work in 90% of the patients, if not 100. Okay. On the other hand, if the patient has mild disease, it is okay that you can always have a chance of changing your treatment if it is not working in a day or two. So this is the physician accepted threshold for choice of antimicrobials. So a high severity illness, lower patient immune status. So this patient qualifies here. So he has high severity. He is 87-year-old, recent steroids, recent tocilizumab, and so on. So all this is going to lower the physician's tolerance of risk. So I want my treatment to be succeeding in 90% of these patients. Okay, so now we must know from prior understanding or from some prior studies, what is the likelihood of susceptibility of Acinetobacter baumannii, because that is the organism which we have found. So if you look at this GLAS priority pathogens, this is of 2019. So maybe things are worse now. But if you look at this is the susceptibility of Acinetobacter baumannii. So the red shows the least because this is a network of multiple centers. So this shows, so you are going to get a range. So the center which showed the least and the center which showed the greatest susceptibility. So that is what we will have to look at. So if you look at this, it is only colistin or polymyxin B, which has between 80 and 100% coverage for Acinetobacter baumannii. If you look at everything else, it is much, much lower. Okay, so if you look at some of these other organisms, they are certainly just in the range of 60-70%. So if you are looking at a seriously ill patient, you already found that it is Acinetobacter baumannii, 80 to 90 or 80 to 100% chances that it will be resistant to all these drugs, but it will only be susceptible to colistin. So this is something which I am a part of this study, but publication, but mainly the study has been done at CMC Vellore by Dr. Balaji, and he has put together what are the percentages of ESBL, carbaphenemases, and even colistin resistance among the different types of gram negatives. So you have different figures for E. coli, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, and Acinetobacter, and we'll turn our attention only to Acinetobacter in this case. So we know that more than 70% have ESBL, more than 70% are carbaphenamase producers, so they will not be susceptible to carbaphenems, and 5% might even be resistant to colistin. Okay, so there is, for Acinetobacter, there is no point in fiddling around with BL, BLIs or carbaphenems. You straight have to go for this. And this was the culture which showed the same organism. And what is not surprising at all is that it is only susceptible to colistin and to some extent to tigecycline. So here we must remember that ceftazidime, avibactam plus aztreonam, which we want to use for Enterobacteriaceae, does not work against Acinetobacter. The reason is Acinetobacter produces different type of enzymes such as OXA23, 24, 51, which actually destroy the avibactam, and therefore avibactam cannot protect the aztreonam from this attack. So neither ceftazidime nor avibactam will be protected from ESBLs, which also Acinetobacter produces, such as TEM and PER, as well as from AMC, and therefore you cannot use any of these drugs. Now we know that polymyxin as well as colistin will give poor results in experimental HAP and WAP, but that is the only drug which you will be able to use. So in that situation, we might want to use polymyxin along with nebulized colistin, perhaps with meropenem. But if you look at this particular patient's meropenem MIC, it was more than 16, and therefore it will not even work at all, even when you use it along with polymyxin B, and for some reason it can also give you inferior results when meropenem is added as an additional drug. So probably in this case we will be using polymyxin B plus nebulized colistin plus either tigecycline or minocycline. Minocycline has better lung penetration, but unless susceptibility is shown, there is no point in using it. So probably this would be the combination treatment which we will require for the variant because of Acinetobacter. We have, as a post meeting from the ICU from Jubilee Hospital, but this was a last year's study. But some of the messages from that are very important. So the incidence of HAI or hospital-acquired infections actually reduced from 43% in August to 7.6% in October. And so did the average length of stay. So what was happening here is the illness had become mild and the ICU was not overburdened. So in August and maybe July, August and so on, there was very poor nursing ratio. There were so many patients who were admitted at one time with very serious problems that the infection control was very difficult to maintain, and therefore such a high percentage of patients were getting hospital-acquired or nosocomial infections. So the reduction of patient load probably led to decrease in the incidence of secondary infections. Maybe we were able to do better infection control practices, but at the same time we must remember, and in the case that I showed you, E. coli, Klebsiella, Enterobacter, Serratia, even Candida, glabrata, these are all endogenous organisms. They are not really coming from the hospital, although some of them can. On the other hand, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Acinetobacter baumannii, Elizabeth kingia, Stenotrophomonas, Chrysobacterium, and Candida auris are actually environmental, and they are coming from water, fomites, blood pressure instruments, temperature gauges, and so many other things which we use in the hospital. What was also important to remember here is that no single case of Staph aureus was found. So, we have this habit of keeping on adding a drug for Staph, especially for MRSA. Now, that may not be required in many patients. We didn't find a single case of Staph aureus developing in them. Similarly, we did not even find strep pneumoniae. Why I'm talking about this is, in the previous influenza epidemic, strep pneumoniae was an important organism which was producing post-influenza pneumonia. Now that was not really found very much in this particular epidemic. At the same time, empiric treatment is difficult as the organism could be resistant in the form of, say, to meropenem, to even ceftazidime avibactam as plus aztreonam, as in the case of Acinetobacter. It might be resistant to polymyxin, so don't think that polymyxin works for all the gram negatives. We can have Serratia as well as Burkholderia. Now, both these are water-derived organisms which come from dialysis water, nebulization, and various other things. And they are actually growing in the patient who's been on colistin or polymyxin B. Okay, so the main drug which we use for this, especially for Burkholderia, is actually Bactrim or trimethoprim sulfur. Then there might be sometimes gram-negative drugs such as gram-negative drugs are not useful to an organism such as Elizabeth kingia. Now, this happens to be a gram-negative organism, but its susceptibility follows that of a gram-positive organism. Okay, so the drugs to use for this are vancomycin, teicoplanin, linezolid, and so on, although it's a gram-negative organism. So this is another trap which can happen because of automation. So when you put a particular card on the Vitek 2, and if you find you use a gram-negative card for this, you will find that it's resistant to everything. So what you need to use is to test these drugs for Elizabeth kingia. And finally, fluconazole, it might definitely not work for Candida glabrata and Candida auris. So the messages from this case are meticulous infection control practices. It's very easy for me to say that, but you know that it is not so easy when you are having an avalanche of cases where the whole system is overloaded. But certainly we should anticipate secondary infections, but at the same time we should rule out colonization. So the doctor needs to be sure that we are not dealing with, because everything which comes in the tracheal aspirate, everything which grows in the urine may not necessarily be the true pathogen. So we have to pay attention to the fact that whether this is a true infection or whether it's colonization. Also, please avoid the most potent prophylactically. In fact, you may not even need any prophylactic drugs if the patient has a mild illness. And we always need to know detailed local epidemiology of the organisms as well as the mechanisms of resistance by which various organisms develop resistance. And all this will then enable us to fashion appropriate therapy, which is going to be tailor-made for that particular patient. And I'll also make this remark that although antiviral therapy such as remdesivir and so on has not directly impacted mortality to a great extent, I will submit to you that it may succeed in reducing the length of stay, length of the that a patient is on a ventilator, length of the time the patient needs a central line. And therefore, with all this, if you can reduce that, that may also help in the management or prevention rather of secondary infections. So I'll close with some of these thoughts. A high index of suspicion for infection needs to be maintained. The diagnostic net needs to be cast wide. The patient is immunocompromised, so he can have multiple sequential infections. Empiric therapy has its limitations. So whenever possible, try to obtain material for all the tests by invasive procedures if necessary. Direct detection of the pathogen, if necessary, by invasive methods should be done. Also, to remind you that multiple simultaneous infections can occur. Aggressive debridement as well as appropriate selection of antimicrobial therapy is essential. We saw that in the case of the abdomen as well as in the case of the sphenoid sinus and skull base osteomyelitis. Now, based on the syndrome, the guidelines and local epidemiology, we might fashion the treatment, and it may have to be escalated, de-escalated, or terminated as clinically relevant. And I'll also end with this thought that stewardship, that means using the antibiotics very wisely, and something which is scientific, which you can justify, has to be promoted even in these challenging times. Because friends, one day this epidemic, waves of epidemic will be, and finally when the dust settles, we are going to be in this position. We'll be peering down, gazing down at a precipice of antimicrobial resistance. So we may probably land in a situation where even greater antimicrobial resistance is occurring. With this, I will stop my screen share, and I'm sure we will have a discussion of your questions, and we can put our minds together.
Thank you, sir, for that excellent presentation. I think those cases were excellent. I think very well managed, and a lot of tips for the listening audience. Just to start the ball rolling, we are expecting few questions in the chat box. They are still awaited. So let me start by asking you, why is that mucorales has become so common post-COVID? There are so many theories which are put forth. As an ID specialist, what's your take on that, sir?
Right. See, first, let us understand that mucorales has always been, mucormycosis has been very common in India. You know, the rates of this is, I'm talking even before COVID came. Okay, so the rates are almost 70 times more than in, say, some of the Western countries, especially America and some European countries. Okay, so what it means is there are lots and lots of mucospores in our environment. So what is it in the soil? What is it in the garbage dumps, or whatever else is there which is generating spores in our environment? That is something which is very important. The next, of course, we know that India is also the diabetes capital of the world. Okay, and we have been told this again and again. Interestingly, diabetes and mucor has a very unhealthy relationship. In the sense, hyperglycemia, ketosis, ketoacidosis, all these are multiple ways in which mucor growth is favored. I also mentioned in the passing that the SARS-CoV-2 virus itself, that destroys the beta cells of the pancreas. So if you have noticed, these patients who are diabetics need extremely high amounts of insulin. I don't think we have that much difficulty in managing diabetes in other seriously ill patients, other groups of this thing. So they really require a large amount of insulin. So the virus is probably destroying that. And the virus itself is producing immune dysregulation. So it is dysregulating our natural killer cells, which is one of the first things as well as the macrophages and polymorphs, which are important defenses for development of the disease like mucormycosis. So you have at least 4 or 5 different explanations. And I have another thought in my mind, which I will put it to you. Let's see if you all agree or not. When I saw in our own hospital and the 2, 3 hospitals that I go to, the number of mucormycosis among the cases which were admitted with COVID was very, very less. Okay, in our hospitals, the number is less than 0.5%. Okay, of locally generated cases of mucormycosis. Whereas we saw a very huge number, but these were referred from other places. Okay, other towns, other villages, not villages, but towns and such other places. So we really don't know what is the denominator. We know national figures. I think there were about 30,000 or 35,000 cases of mucormycosis. That is what was told on TV and so on. And if we have, say, 3 crores of patients who had COVID, then if you put the ratio, it will come to less than 1%. Okay, so total number is not so much. Total number is very high, but the percentage is not very high. The other important thing what I noticed is, most of the patients whom I have seen were the patients who had very mild disease, yet they were given steroids. Then they were not admitted or admitted just for a day or two. So they spent their time in the community and then they got mucormycosis. On the other hand, those patients, so what it tells me is that environmental exposure in the community seems to be very important for mucor. On the other hand, those patients who were serious and were receiving steroids but remained in the ICU, remained in the hospital for 1 or 2 months also, they did not get mucor in that number. Some of them got aspergillosis. So this is my finding. I put it to all our audience. If they agree with this, have they also observed something similar or their experience is different? So I am quite clear in my mind what is the reason for this big epidemic of mucorales.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Just for the knowledge of, it's a mixed audience. So I just wanted to ask you basically what's going to be your choice of antifungals when it comes to aspergillus. Can you just elaborate mucorales versus maybe candida and non-candida albicans? What remains the first choice? Sometimes in a smaller cities, it's not possible to go up with a lot of higher investigative workup. Although, as you said earlier, in the first case, it's better to get to the root cause, locate or whatever, identify the organism, and then maybe start the antifungals. But sometimes patients are very sick and then we need to act appropriately. So what's going to be your empirical choice, so as to say?
Yeah, actually I discussed this point. I made that table which tells us what each organism, what each drug is covering. Okay, so you're never really wrong if you use amphotericin B. Okay, that is, it will have some action against most of the invasive fungal infections. But if you want to fine tune your treatment, then if you are very, very sure that this is only aspergillus, and I'm quite, I don't know how to be so sure, because in my experience, 10 to 15% will have aspergillus plus mucor. And as I discussed with you, if I use voriconazole in that patient, then we may be actually increasing the pathogenicity of mucor. So I don't want that to happen. So in this epidemic, at least I will probably not want to use voriconazole. So then I will have to use an azole, which will work for both. So it will have to be either posaconazole or isavuconazole. So to my mind, if you are dealing with a rhino, see, let us go by the syndromic approach. So if you have a rhino-orbital cerebral, it is much more likely to be mucor than aspergillus. Okay, so if that is the case, then it will be, we should probably not be using echinocandins, we should not be using voriconazole, forget fluconazole, of course. So you'll have to use only posaconazole or isavuconazole. If you have a pulmonary problem, now there may be some ways of, short of microbiology, there are some other ways, but again, they are also high tech. So the imaging features on a HRCT are quite important. They may help us to think of mucor versus aspergillus. It will also help us if we do the beta-D-glucan and galactomannan. Now, these are not really available everywhere, but if both these tests are persistently negative, then it is much more likely to be Mucor, because Mucor does not produce these test positivity. These are only there in Aspergillus. But again, the issue is so complex. Now, supposing you see that both are positive, then you are quite certain that there is aspergillosis. But can you be sure that there is no additional Mucor? Okay, so again, there is a problem. So it is not very easy to make an empirical choice. These are some rough ways in which I can say what we should do. Now, if you find that there is Candida, now it is all, it's quite easy to know what might be the organism, what might be its susceptibility. Not very easy. It's easy for me to say that, but in practice it is not so easy. But if you pay a lot of attention to what drugs the patient received earlier, whether it is likely to be derived from the bowel or is it likely to be coming from the central venous catheter, and so on, then you can make some guess as to what might be the species of Candida and what might be the susceptibility. For example, if many of you might be knowing that Candida parasilosis is another type of species. Now, this Candida parasilosis, remember PP, so it loves plastic. So it is generally occurs in patients who have a central venous catheter or something else which is a polyethylene material in their body. And this is an organism where echinocandins do not work so well. Okay, so you cannot really paint everything with one brush. I know by and large we say that echinocandins is the drug of choice, but in this situation, perhaps fluconazole may be better. Okay, so a much cheaper drug, perhaps potential for oral treatment, is going to be better than a much more costly drug in some situations. Okay, so the whole thing is vastly complicated, and finally there is no good remedy except to find good microbiology.
Yeah. Next question is, sir, if a patient comes with a cavitating lesion on a chest X-ray CT, what all differentials you would consider and how you would proceed?
Correct. So this is a wonderful question, and so we will have to now see what are the imaging features. So to my mind, if you have a nodule which is cavitating, okay, so that is slightly different from a thin walled cavity. So this is a very thick walled cavity, and if you have the opportunity to see the patient right as the patient is developing this problem, then initially you will see that the amount of necrosis is just a little bit in the center of that cavity. So I call it as a nodular cavitation rather than cavity. Okay, and then as time goes, supposing you see such a patient a little later, then that area of necrosis is going on increasing, and you will see a lot of necrotic material which is raggy shaggy appearance in the center of that nodule. Now, if you look at a usual bacterial abscess, or a lung abscess, that generally produces a horizontal fluid level. That material that is there inside that is quite liquid, and therefore you see an air fluid level which is horizontal. Whereas most of the time with fungal, this material, it really liquefies the lung tissue in such a way that you get a lot of necrotic, dirty material, and therefore it is like semi-solid content. It doesn't have a good air fluid level. So this is something. You may also have a surrounding halo, which is supposed to be somewhat a pointer towards, say, Aspergillus. And there is another phenomenon called as a reverse halo sign, and we've seen that in Mucorales. So that is much more suggestive of Mucor. At the end of it, even if we say all these things, we finally need proof. Now, the next non-invasive way to know this is by doing this beta-D-glucan and galactomannan. And as I told you that if these are positive, it is much more likely that this is going to be Aspergillus. But at the same time, I can't say that there is no additional Mucor in that patient. So that is a big difficulty here. Now, you can have sometimes false positive galactomannan, because often what we use in our patients is generic piperacillin, tazobactam, and so on. So if you are using them, then the galactomannan may be falsely positive. So you can just imagine a situation where the patient has a pulmonary Mucor, but his galactomannan is falsely positive because of use of pip-tazo. So now the physician will think, oh, galactomannan is positive, so this must be aspergillus. So he will be misled by that. So you have to pay attention, like, is this patient on ongoing peptizo? And if you really want to know whether it is due to that, look at whether it is the brand, which brand you are using. And after 4 or 5 days, instead of that galactomannan increasing, it actually disappears or reduces. Okay, so if you stop that piperacillin tazobactam. Of course, this, on that day of when the test comes, you cannot easily make out that. This is only in retrospect. And again, it will mean you have to do the galactomannan again and again. So if you have cost limitation, then that is also a problem. But let me tell you one thing, if you see how much the patient spends in the ICU every day with so many drugs and so many other things, some of these tests, they appear to cost 3,000-4,000 or something, but actually it may work better, to do some of these tests, because you will avoid many unnecessary drugs and expenditure and so on. And if you can make the patient all right quickly, it will definitely help. Also, you have to see what are the antibiotics that a patient is taking. So supposing the patient is already taking lots of antibiotics which will cover whatever bacterial organisms are coming from the tracheal aspirate. See, tracheal aspirate will almost always show you some bacteria. Now, are those bacteria being sort of susceptible to whatever the drugs the patient is receiving? So if the answer is yes, then we have to say that these bacteria are not the true cause of this problem, because you have a lesion which is increasing. The patient is on these antibiotics, and the bacteria that we have found are susceptible to that antibiotic. Then how can they have to explain the increasing size of that lesion? So that means this has to be something which is not being covered by whatever treatment the patient is receiving just now. So if it's not being covered with either posaconazole, voriconazole or something like that, then it could be a fungal, means a mold infection. Another term which I do not like is we often use fungal infection for lung. Please remember that Candida never produces any lung infection. Never means almost never. So in the lung, it is going to be a mold infection. So mold are all these, Aspergillus, Mucor, you have Fusarium, you have Scedosporium, and so on. Those are mold infections. Whereas Candida will generally not produce a lung infection. So the drugs which we use for Candida, such as fluconazole, or even echinocandins for that matter, are not preferred drugs for mold infections at all, in the lungs especially.
Dr. Rajesh, you have any questions?
Yes, sir. So this time we've seen that COVID has been a long COVID, and in children we've been knowing this syndrome called multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. Sir, do you think adults we should expect such kind of a syndrome?
I have seen. Yes, it is certainly seen, and I have seen quite a good number of cases where you have cardiac failure, you have LV dysfunction, you have liver abnormalities, fever, rash, desquamating rash, redness, and all that, and all the inflammatory markers are quite high. So I have seen, although it was first described as MIS-C, that means multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, and we have seen also some cases which resemble Takayasu, not Takayasu, Kawasaki syndrome. Yeah, Kawasaki. Yeah. So, but in adults also we have seen this kind of thing, and so we do see, and we also see other immune.
It's a very diagnostic problem.
Yeah, it's a great dilemma.
You'll find high inflammatory markers, CRP will be raised, everything will be raised, and sometimes there could be some superadded index, and we may miss that, and we may think that it is MIS-A, and perhaps we would just start him on steroids, and so any way to clinically differentiate between MIS-A and any other opportunistic infection?
So clinically, so you have to examine in detail and see whether any signs of sepsis are there or just an inflammation is there. So generally the PCT may not be very high, the patient will not be really hypotensive or anything. Septic focus will not be found by whatever way we can image the patient. In that way, we may be able to suspect. And as I said, skin manifestations, erythema, rashes, sometimes joint pains, prominent LFT alterations, and LV dysfunction. So these are not almost always all of them are not present in other septic, if there are other septic foci and so on. But I agree that in a given patient, it is somewhat difficult. Quite difficult, I would say.
One of the opportunistic infections that we should not forget is tuberculosis in post-COVID
Yes, absolutely.
patients.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
what
correct.
are the ways tuberculosis is being presented in your experience in post-COVID? I mean, I've not seen pulmonary coughs, but do you think that sometime maybe renal tuberculosis or any other tuberculosis would be, and how do we go about trying to diagnose tuberculosis in post-COVID? Because sometimes patients after COVID infection present with low-grade fever, loss of appetite, some body loss of weight, and then we are in a dilemma where, and then there are no way to start anti-TB drugs in such patients. So, what is your take on it? What are the presentation of tuberculosis in post-COVID, sir?
I showed you one case where the patient had mucormycosis in rhinoorbital and cerebral tuberculomas. Okay, so same way we have seen lymph nodes, abdominal TB, genitourinary TB, and they would present almost in the same fashion that they present in non-COVID groups. Generally, it takes 2 to 3 months for TB to activate and so on, but it could happen faster also because it depends on the amount of immunocompromise as well as the amount of load that the patient has as latent tuberculosis. The latent TB could be in the bone, it can be in the spine, and so on. So far, I have not seen anything coming in the spine. I have seen only bacterial infections coming in the spine, as well as in the joints. So you have seen septic arthritis as well as spondylodiscitis because of bacteria as well as fungus. So far, I have not seen, but I'm sure it can happen. TB can happen anywhere else. And again, the standard fashion, if it is extrapulmonary TB, you will still need to do a biopsy, expert pyrosequencing, TB midget culture, histopathology to make that diagnosis of TB. Recently, I had a case where it was a post-COVID case, and there was a high-grade fever and abdominal symptoms, and the patient had a marked thickening of the terminal ileum as well as the adjacent cecum. So the differential diagnosis was between TB and typhoid. Okay, and there were various ways in which we would make that diagnosis. This patient did turn out to be typhoid, and actually blood cultures were also positive. But basically, a lot of imaging, gastroenterology, consultation, colonoscopy, all these things were done with the notion that this could be abdominal TB. It turned out to be typhoid. So, as I said, community exposures such as to typhoid in our country is very, very common. So even if he gets COVID, he is still going to have the love for contaminated food, or pani puri and bel puri is bound to be there. So people are going to get these kind of infections. TB, of course, is a reactivation disease. So it's a reactivation of latent foci. And I showed you that case of cerebral tuberculomas, but TB can reactivate virtually anywhere. So extrapulmonary, if it is there, we will still need all the biopsy and histopath and all. To my mind, today, at least I am talking of tertiary centers and big cities. I can't tell about everything else. Therapeutic trial of TB has almost gone away from current contemporary practice because the imaging and everything else is that way so good that it is very, very rare for at least in my practice to start a therapeutic trial. We can always show that there is TB in some way or the other.
So, if it is renal tuberculosis, how do you go about diagnosing? I mean, do you do a PCR in the urine?
Yes, don't even say PCR. Do expert. Listen, see that old PCR for TB was not so good, not so sensitive, but expert is very sensitive. We can definitely pick up from expert ultra, especially in the urine. And then there are other tests. Of course, TB midget culture will take a very, very long time and so on. But these are the ways in which, so even genitourinary TB, we should definitely try to make a diagnosis.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, few questions from the chat box, sir. This is from a surgeon.
Yes.
In a very moribund patient with severe COVID, with almost end-stage disease, is it worth doing extensive debridement when mucor is said to be diagnosed? a very sick patient, Mucor is diagnosed, would you go ahead with a debridement?
It depends on, I mean, if the patient is hypotensive in septic shock and so on, then obviously management of that shock will take precedence over debridement. But otherwise, debridement should be attempted in almost all cases whenever possible. Debulking and debridement is very important because remember here that thrombosis is there, and therefore the drugs that we give for Mucor do not reach the site of actual where the fungus is actually there. Also, dead hyphae, remember those which are dead as a result of drugs, they also can stick to the endothelium. They also can produce the toxin called as mucorrhizin. So the debulking that as much as possible should be attempted in a given patient. I mean, it will depend on really how sick the patient is. If the patient is almost expected to die in one day or maybe half a day or something like that, in such a patient it is unlikely that debridement is going to solve anything.
Yeah. Next question is ceftazidime avibactam better to treat VAP as compared to polymyxin for susceptible organism? Any susceptible organism with a VAP?
Yes. Yeah. Let me come to that. This is again a very important question. I did sort of address that question, but let me reiterate some points again. So first of all, we are talking of Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, or Acinetobacter. So what is the etiology of that VAP? I discussed one case where there was Acinetobacter. For Acinetobacter, ceftazidime avibactam and aztreonam are almost valueless because of the different OXA enzymes which they have. Okay, so for this organism, you are going to use only polymyxin or colistin. And because we know that colistin penetrates only about colistin or polymyxin penetration into the lung is only 15-20%. We know that in experimental HAP, VAP, and so on in pneumonias, we have very poor results with these group of drugs. That's why we need an additional drug. And I indicated in that case, maybe tigecycline, maybe minocycline, and plus lot of nebulization of colistin. So that is if it is Acinetobacter. Now, if it is Klebsiella, which is again a very important problem in our country, which would produce HAP or VAP, in this situation, definitely ceftazidime avibactam plus aztreonam will be much better. Now, all these drugs will penetrate into the lung very well, and plus their intrinsic activity is much higher than that of polymyxins. So, if we have this organism, then definitely go in for ceftazidime avibactam plus aztreonam. Now, if you have a facility to find out which enzymes this organism is producing, I didn't discuss that part here, but supposing there is a test called as expert CARBA-R. So the mechanisms of developing, say, carbapenem resistance, the enzymatic mechanisms at least are IMP, WIMP, KPC, as well as OXA48 and NDM. Okay, so these are the 5 things which are present in that expert CARBA-R. So if you do that test, and if you find that this organism is only producing OXA48 and no NDM, then in that situation you can use only ceftazidime avibactam. However, if it is producing both NDM as well as OXA48, then you have to use both. And supposing it is producing only NDM, so you cannot have such an organism which is producing only NDM. It will also produce ESBL, it might even produce MC and so on. So if you give for that thinking that, okay, there is only NDM, so I should use only aztreonam, then again that's a trap because aztreonam will get easily destroyed by the simple ESBL. So you cannot use aztreonam alone for the majority of the organisms, and this test is not for ESBL and MC. Okay, so it is only for these 5 enzymes which I talked about.
Yeah.
So this is how we will plan, and because for Klebsiella, these drugs are available, they have much better penetration as well as intrinsic activity. They are the drugs of choice rather than colistin or polymyxin.
Yeah, next question in the chat box.
Unless you are seeing this kind of thing on a day in and day out basis, it will be difficult to remember.
Yeah. How to differentiate between colonization from a true pathogen?
That's a lecture by itself. Okay, so very briefly, you have to look at the organism, you have to look at the patient, you have to look at that site, and you have to look at what happens on follow. I'll just give you just a very brief examples. Actually, on Google also you will find an article by me on this issue. It's a old article, very old, I think more than 10-15 years old, but I think all the points in that still remain valid. So if you look at the lesion, that lesion should show erythema, induration, pain, and so on. Any ulcer which is there is likely to show colonizer. Unless it shows signs of inflammation, we cannot be sure that whatever is isolated is actually the true pathogen. If you look at tracheal aspirate, now tracheal aspirate, almost everybody's tracheal aspirate will show something or the other. Okay, so now what is important to remember is the tracheal aspirate culture or colony counts or whatever do not have a high positive predictive value. They have a good negative predictive value. So if you find that nothing is seen, and if there is an infiltrate, it is very unlikely that the patient that is actually pneumonia. It is likely to be embolism, infarct, something else. Okay, so the negative predictive value is good, positive predictive value is not so good. The reason is this, that MAP or HAP is present only in a minority of the patients who are colonized. Now this is a simple statistical principle that the pre-test likelihood, if it is high, then you will have a good positive predictive value. If the pre-test likelihood is low, then the test cannot have a high positive predictive value. Okay, so you will need to relate that whatever you see with the syndrome that the patient is having. Is there an alternative explanation? Sometimes you will see pulmonary edema and then the patient undergoes dialysis or undergoes diuresis and everything goes away. And we thought that this organism is producing HAP or VAP. The infiltrate itself has gone away. Okay, so all these things we need to pay attention to in order to differentiate colonization from invasion. It's an extremely important clinical problem, and it is a problem to be solved by physicians, not by microbiologists.
So extension of the same question, sir. Candida in urine, is it to be treated or?
Right.
Candida in urine.
Yes, Candida in urine, if the patient is asymptomatic and patient is catheterized, it is something which is almost universal, I would say. Okay, so then we call this as an asymptomatic candiduria. So if it is asymptomatic candiduria, then we have to treat that patient only in newborn, in patients who are neutropenic, in patients who are undergoing a urological procedure. In all other groups of patients, you have to just change the catheter. And also don't think that this candida is the cause of the patient's sepsis, because we might be misled into treating that candida, whereas the actual cause for the sepsis may be somewhere else. So this is a very important thing in ICU practice, that candida is almost always there. Now when I say asymptomatic, or if the patient is unconscious, he cannot have any symptoms or dysuria. So it is not possible to make out that. So there we need to use our clinical judgment. So generally candida, but while I am saying all this, I must also remind you that sometimes candida in the urine, especially if it is a non-catheterized patient, it can actually indicate a descending candida infection. That means it is coming from the candidemia. It is already a first indicator of candida bloodstream infection, and that seeds the kidney. Remember, kidney receives a very huge amount of blood supply. So if there is candida in the blood, it may actually produce a kidney lesion or a kidney abscess, and that might produce candida in the urine. So that is what we may call as a descending candida infection, or otherwise it is usually an ascending one. So by and large, the candida which comes from the urinary tract does not involve or does not invade the bloodstream. Similarly, the candida which comes from respiratory tract does not invade the bloodstream, by and large. What invades the bloodstream is the one which is coming from the GI tract. That is the more important thing. And when you have mucositis, when you have low perfusion of the gastrointestinal tract, that candida will now enter into the bloodstream. And the other most important source of candida is obviously the central venous catheter. Okay, so urine and respiratory, especially respiratory, is never a cause of candidemia. In fact, they have done very nice studies. They have done strain concordance studies. So, they in some sophisticated way, you can find out whether the candida in the blood and the candida in the urine is exactly identical or not. So it is. So they have found that the two are not concordant. In other words, those coming from these sites do not generally enter the bloodstream.
Yeah, Rajesh, over to you.
Sir, this is not about post-COVID infections, but in your practice of treating COVID-19, do you think remdesivir works?
Yes.
It does work.
That is the short answer.
Okay. I think one more question in the chat box. Somebody says that what test to run for Pseudomonas or Klebsiella resistance? PCR, what sample you prefer?
See, basically it is blood culture. And blood culture, if you are doing on a Vitek machine, you will get some indication what it is, whether it is resistant or susceptible. Now, if you want to know what is the mechanism of resistance, then there are 2-3 options. One is called as a BCID panel. Another is called as this expert Karba-R, which we talked about. And there is another test called as sepsis flow. Now, these are all molecular tests. So you need to do PCRs for finding out different mechanisms of resistance. But at the end of it, what I would say is the number of mechanisms of resistance is so high and so complex, and such combinations occur that it is not very easy to make sense out of all this. So that's why I prefer generally this expert Karbar, but sometimes BCID is also very, very useful. It's much more expensive. But again, we are talking about expense. But if we give a wrong treatment, see, sometimes I say that the most expensive antibiotic is the one which does not work. Okay, rather than anything else. So trying to find out is actually generally pays dividends.
So is the PCR used for fungal infections also?
It is, see, we don't have that very well developed PCR, but for Aspergillus, it is being used. For Candida also, it is being used, and actually for Mucorales also. But the problem is the contamination in the laboratory, and see, fungal spores are just there everywhere, So it is not surprising that it is very difficult to have avoid contamination in the laboratory and so on. If you do it in respiratory samples also, see, all of us might have some conidia which are colonizing our airways. Now they may give you a positive PCR. Does it really mean anything? There are lots of difficulties of using there are some cutoffs of CT values. You may have to do it repeatedly. It is still, it is not ready for prime time. That's what I'm thinking. It may come up very soon.
And sir, how far?
Even blood PCR is also very good for Candida, but not so easy, because you don't even know what is the true, whether there is something called as T2MR and all these. Still, they are not yet available in our country.
Sir, how far fungal culture and sensitivity is to be actually followed and tried to be used in clinical practice? I mean, it's not available very easily, but still, I mean, if it is available.
So, again, by fungal, do you mean mold or yeast or Candida?
Yeah, it could be Candida basically, or even.
Okay, so for Candida, it's not so difficult because for Candida, the Vitek gives you a fairly okay type of susceptibility. There are some issues of testing some of the Candida and some of the drugs, but in usual practice, yes, it is fairly okay. When it comes to molds, it is very, very difficult. Mold susceptibility is done only in some centers. It's more expensive, and even more difficult is, I don't know what sort of audience we are talking to today, but even if MICs of molds are done, you need to relate them to breakpoints. Now, breakpoints are not available for molds. What we have are called as epidemiological cutoffs. Now, these are very complex issues there. I don't think we should talk in the general audience. Someday we can just have a talk, say 1-to-1 or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
But there are a lot of first one is not available, and what to make sense about what that MIC means. Does it mean it is susceptible? Does it mean it is resistant? Is not easy.
Praveen sir, I think there is one more chat box question which I am not able to see.
Yeah, okay. So basically, it's about abdominal pain post-COVID. How do you go about, sir? Actually, what could be the various reasons? I think.
So
This was
like I
one
said,
question.
yeah, so thrombosis of some vessels can be a very important thing. I have seen a case, a small child whose COVID was almost asymptomatic, and he infected his entire small bowel. And later on, he was transplanted. His father donated a segment of his intestine because it was a small child. He was only a, I think, 8 to 10 years old person. He's doing very well with that small amount, small length of small bowel which his father was able to donate to him. So that COVID was very mild. So severe abdominal pain, necrosis of the entire bowel, or that's an extreme example, but you can definitely have bowel ischemia and so on. Other causes of abdominal pain can be secondary infection. Now, mucor producing infection of the small bowel is also something which I have seen. Okay, and that is very difficult to diagnose. So what the patient has is high WBC count, abdominal pain, bleeding from the means hematochezia, lower GI bleeding, and then if you actually explore, you will find that the bowel has become black in color. Even then, you don't know whether it is mucor or whether it is. If you see that the vessel is patent, or vessel could be thrombosed, so that also doesn't help you. So it's only the biopsy after resection which will tell you. Rarely, I've seen a few cases where gastroscopy or colonoscopy has also picked up mucor in the bowel. So rare, but all these things are possible.
One last question, sir. Can you tell us about the 16S RNA test? I have not heard of it. So that was.
I don't have great personal experience, but there are a few centers where this test is being done. So with the help of that, they can actually identify what is the organism, means a bacterial species especially, or actually 18S rRNA is for fungal species also. So it's quite deep into the molecular territory. I have not yet ventured there, and not much experience of using
Something
it.
like multitoph,
So it can help. No. Multitoph requires a culture.
Okay.
See, this is done only on a specimen, even without identifying it. Multitoph, and then you are going to identify that bug after a day or two or whatever. Multitoph will give you instantaneous identification. So that is the benefit of multitoph. But culture has to be there. Culture has to be pure also. A good culture has to be there.
Thank you so much, sir, for that exhaustive session. And I hand over the mic to Dr. Babita, the president of IMA, to make
Sir,
few
one more
IMA.
question.
Yeah, just hold on, Babita.
Post-COVID areas, any thing that you would like to say in patients who have had COVID and they have had chronic diarrhea, any thing to be, organism to be thought about, or is it something
See, if the person has received lots of antibiotics and spent time in the ICU, then always think of Clostridium difficile, definitely. And otherwise, if the patient is severely immunocompromised, then he can get. But I have not seen things like Cryptosporidium and other things which we see in say transplant recipients and HIV and all that. We have not. At least I have not seen so far. But I suppose all of them can happen.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Over to you, Babita, for some IMA announcement and to propose a formal vote of thanks.
So, first of all, let me apologize. My network was very bad, so I couldn't log in and I couldn't welcome you, sir. But thanks for this exhaustive and a very elaborate session on post-COVID issues, and especially with the thrust on the fungal infections. I think Dr. Praveen and Dr. Rajesh, both of them, they were always very keen on organizing this post-COVID fungal infections. And so we are extremely thankful to you for having accepted our invitation and for being over here. Thanks once again, sir. And thanks to Dr. Praveen and Dr. Rajesh Zavirani for moderating this, and to, in my absence, to welcome sir and give a very good introduction. Sir, once again, thank you so much, and we do
Thank you.
hope to associate with you in future, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
sir. Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Thank you once again.
Thank you so much.